Buju, wago shindagu migizi indodem, gazaga squaji mekag, indun jaba. After the United States Civil War was concluded, there was a big shift in the policy towards Native Americans. There had been conflict prior to the United States Civil War, but it escalated afterwards in some of the most famous conflicts between the United States government and tribes. This was an impossible time for Native American leaders. If they fought, they were usually crushed and forced to sign treaties by which large swaths of their land were taken from them. But if they did not fight, they were still, like the Cherokee, who were very accommodating, marched off on a trail of tears and forced to endure the same kinds of land loss and assimilation. At the same time that the land grabs were happening, the United States economy was transforming from an agricultural economy to one that had agriculture and industry. And there was an effort as part of America's colonial enterprise to thoroughly destroy indigenous communities. And there were many different ways to do that. Colonization has always worked, not by simply killing everyone and not simply by crushing everyone, but by taking members of the subject group, those who would be colonized, and bringing them into the fabric of the colonial culture so that they could then be the effective colonizers going forward. In fact, the British conquered the Irish not by having a British soldier on every street corner, but by hiring a bunch of Irishmen and giving them jobs in the British army to go oppress their fellow countrymen. It happened in the Native American experience by taking members of one vanquished tribe and giving them jobs as scouts in the United States Army to go vanquish the next tribe. While this was happening, it became very clear, and it had always been this way throughout all of the colonial enterprises, the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Americans, among many others, that it would be important to sort of win the hearts and minds, to colonize children, and that the most effective way to do that would be through their education as an indoctrination into the colonial culture. After the United States Civil War in America, there was a man named Captain Richard Henry Pratt. He had been a career military man, and he became engaged in the debates about Indian education. And famously, this quote was attributed to him that our goal is to kill the Indian in order to save the man. And by that, he meant that if we can destroy the tribal cultures, languages, customs of dress, and connections to community and family, that we will actually be doing a tremendous favor to Indigenous people, and that we will then afford to those kids all the benefits of American citizenship. We will assimilate them. It was misguided and never did deliver those results, but it had a tremendous impact on Native people. Carlisle, which was an old Army campus, was converted into the first industrial school for Native kids. They moved as many children from as many as 58 different tribes there, and intentionally brought them far from their native communities so that it would be more difficult to run away. They received haircuts and had their clothes burned and received military-style uniforms, would march to and from class. These things alone could be traumatic for children. For many tribes, hair was never cut unless there was a death in the family. And here these kids being removed from their families, sent to some place far away where they don't know anybody, and the first thing that happens is a haircut. So they, without even knowing English, had to sort through and try to figure out what this meant and what was happening. Many children wouldn't see their families for 12 years. And some of the before and after pictures really tell the story well about what happens as the kids are being transformed in these schools. The schools themselves did tremendous trauma to the Native kids. Lots of people died there. In fact, if you could imagine sending your child to school and not getting a body back and not having choice over the kind of religious ceremony that would be used for your kid's funeral, and not even knowing when they died. The communication was so poor. Whole books have been written using evidence, which were the letters that kids wrote to their parents and parents wrote to their kids, which were never delivered because the schools kept the correspondence. There were revelations of not just harsh physical punishments, but torture at the schools. All of the schools in the United States kept cemeteries for the kids. The system began in earnest in Canada shortly after it did in the United States, and it continued in Canada after it was starting to wind down in the United States. The end result is that most people in the grandparent generation went to residential boarding schools in Canada and the United States. By that I mean most of the living grandparents today went through that experience, and certainly the great-grandparents. And it was incredibly traumatic. Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was focused on the residential boarding school experience for Native kids. And among the things that they determined were that some of the schools used electric chairs as a torture for children at the schools. By the way, in both the United States and in Canada, the governments couldn't create enough schools fast enough to keep up with the demand for now that it was compulsory that all Native kids attend these schools. So in both countries, they ended up subcontracting a lot of the school development to churches. So the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, and others became involved in the Indian education business. And in many places, eventually more kids went to the church-run boarding schools, which were funded by the US and Canadian governments, in which many, many children were killed. In Canada's Truth and Reconciliation, the research identified, in that case, 150,000 Native kids who were sent to these schools. They documented, by the time the TRC concluded, 3,201 deaths, but the research was ongoing, and even after the TRC published their official findings, there were revelations of big mass graves at a number of different schools. So they estimate there could be as many as 30,000 Native children who died in Canada. In the United States, we have not had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a proper or formal investigation, so we have no idea how many kids died at the schools. Canada had 80 schools that were being run. 44 of them were run by churches. And in the United States, we actually had an even more pervasive policy. In 2022, the revelations of the mass graves at some of the Canadian schools brought Pope Francis to Canada to issue an apology, which I will quote here. He said, "I also feel shame, sorrow and shame for the role that a number of Catholics, particularly those with educational responsibilities, have had in these things that wounded you and the abuses you suffered, and the lack of respect shown for your identity, your culture, and even your spiritual values. For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church, I ask for God's forgiveness and want to say to you all with my heart, I am very sorry. And I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops, in asking your pardon." In my view, on the one hand, while it is welcome that the Pope was willing to issue an apology, what he said in the way that he worded this apology was, "I apologize for the actions of a few bad actors." But he did not say that the Catholic Church takes responsibility for orchestrating oppression or covering up the deaths of so many children. The TRC identified widespread, endemic, physical and sexual abuse of the children who attended these schools, and that was at the church-run schools and the government-run schools. And all of this needs a proper acknowledgement from governments, churches, and our citizenries in both the United States and Canada. I feel like this is an emerging effort. In Canada, certainly the governments have started to allocate resources towards restorative justice efforts, including monies that could be allocated for Indigenous language revitalization and so forth. But it is one thing for the governments and the churches to push everyone into these pits, and it's another thing to climb back out. We don't get to healed by skipping all the healing, and we don't get to reconciled by skipping all the reconciling. Miigwech. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, resources for the Ojibwe language, teachers, and more. Miigwech.